Tonight, we're diving into the darker, stranger, and downright shocking side of Christmas. Forget everything you think you know about silent nights and peaceful winter celebrations. The real history of Christmas is filled with banned holidays, demonic creatures, soldiers crossing battle lines, and transformations that would make even Scrooge's ghosts blush. From ancient non-Christian rituals to Victorian changes, from terrifying folklore monsters to modern myths, Christmas has always been far more complex and fascinating than the tidy picture on a greeting card. So settle in as we explore the untold stories, the forgotten traditions, and the shocking truths behind the world's most celebrated holiday. Long before anyone sang carols or hung stockings, December was already a time of celebration. Our ancestors, living through the darkest days of winter, marked the winter solstice with festivals that would make modern Christmas parties look tame. The ancient Romans threw Saturnalia, a wild week-long party honoring Saturn, the god of farming. During Saturnalia, which ran from December 17th through the 23rd, normal social order flipped upside down. Slaves became masters for a day. People feasted, drank heavily, gambled openly, and engaged in behavior that would later horrify Christian reformers. Homes were decorated with greenery, candles lit the darkness, and gifts were exchanged freely. Further north, Germanic peoples celebrated Yule, their own midwinter festival. The Yule log burned for 12 days, warding off evil spirits and welcoming back the sun. These celebrations weren't gentle or quiet. They were loud, chaotic, sometimes violent expressions of relief that the worst of winter had passed and light would return. But here's where it gets interesting. When Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, church leaders faced a problem. How do you convince people to abandon beloved traditions that have defined their winters for generations? The answer was surprisingly practical. You don't fight them. You take them over. The Bible never mentions the date of Jesus' birth. Not December, not winter, not even a hint about the season. In fact, based on the biblical mention of shepherds tending their flocks at night in the fields, some scholars suggest spring or early fall might be more likely, as shepherds in the region typically brought their flocks in from the fields during the coldest winter months. Yet by 336 A.D., the Church in Rome had officially established December 25th as the celebration of Christ's birth during the reign of Emperor Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor. Why December 25th specifically? For decades, historians assumed Christians deliberately chose this date to take over non-Christian festivals like Saturnalia and Sol Invictus, the birthday of the unconquered sun, which Emperor Aurelian had established in 274 A.D. According to this theory, by placing Christmas on the same date, church leaders could add Christian meaning onto existing celebrations, making the transition easier for people converting to Christianity. But newer research reveals a more complex picture. Some ancient old writings suggest Christians may have been calculating December 25th on their own, based on religious reasoning, rather than non-Christian festivals. Early Christian writers like Sextus Julius Africanus in 221 A.D. dated when Jesus was conceived to March 25th, the spring equinox, when day and night are equal length. Count 9 months forward, and you arrive at December 25th. Similar calculations in the Eastern Church, using April 6th as the date of conception, led to January 6th for Christmas, which is why Eastern Orthodox churches celebrate on that date. Texts like the Liber Pontificalis suggest Christians may have celebrated Christmas as early as the 2nd century, long before any supposed attempt to compete with non-Christian festivals. So the truth is probably somewhere in between. December 25th emerged from a combination of religious calculations, practical politics, and the irresistible pull of existing winter celebrations. Regardless of how it started, by the Middle Ages, Christmas had become firmly established. But it looked nothing like the Christmas we know. In many regions, particularly for those who could afford to celebrate, medieval Christmas was a loud and wild 12-day festival. Think less Silent Night and more Animal House. There was feasting, yes, but also heavy drinking, gambling, wild parties, and rowdy behavior that would shock what modern people think is proper. The poor would go door to door demanding food and drink from the wealthy, a tradition called wassailing that sometimes turned violent when the rich refused. Social class differences temporarily broke down, or at least wobbled dangerously. This wild spirit of Christmas celebration would eventually trigger a backlash so severe that in parts of Europe and America, Christmas would be banned entirely. But before we get to that shocking chapter, we need to meet some of the darker characters who have haunted Christmas celebrations for centuries. While children today worry about coal in their stockings, their medieval counterparts had far more terrifying concerns. Lurking in the shadows of alpine folklore is Krampus, a creature so nightmarish he makes the Grinch look cuddly by comparison. Picture this. It's the evening of December 5th in a small Austrian village. The church bells ring in the darkness. Children peek nervously from windows as a horrifying figure emerges from the woods. Covered in dark matted fur crowned with curved goat horns, tongue lolling from a demonic face, Krampus stalks through the streets dragging heavy chains. In one clawed hand, he carries birch switches for beating naughty children. In the other, or strapped to his back, an empty basket or sack. According to various regional legends, that sack served different purposes. In some traditions, Krampus would carry away the worst children to his lair, while other tales suggested he dragged them straight to the underworld. Krampus isn't a recent invention. References to this half-goat, half-demon creature date back to at least the 16th century, though his roots may reach even further back. The name itself derives from the German word Krampen, meaning claw. Folklorists believe that in Germanic non-Christian celebrations of the winter solstice, young men would dress in frightening costumes and masks, embodying wild spirits who would chase away evil and protect the community through the darkest time of year. A female figure called Perchta, both beautiful and terrifying, also featured in these ancient rituals. When Christianity arrived, these non-Christian traditions didn't disappear. Instead, they transformed. Krampus became the dark companion to St. Nicholas, the kindly bishop who rewarded good children. While St. Nicholas arrived on December 6th bearing gifts, Krampus came the night before, December 5th, to punish the wicked. It's a perfect pairing, reward and punishment, light and shadow, the carrot and the stick. The Catholic Church repeatedly tried to stop Krampus celebrations, viewing them as too much like old non-Christian beliefs, too frightening, and too closely resembling the devil. In some regions and time periods, Krampus festivals were indeed banned. But the tradition proved remarkably strong, kept alive by communities who saw value in this cautionary figure. By the 19th century, Krampus had become so ingrained in Alpine culture that greeting cards called Krampuskarten began appearing. These weren't your typical cheerful holiday cards. They depicted Krampus in all his terrifying glory, stuffing screaming children into his sack, chasing victims with switches, or in some unexpectedly adult-themed cards from the early 1900s, interacting with young women in ways that mixed horror with unexpected flirtation. The cards often bore the greeting Gruß vom Krampus, greetings from Krampus. These traditions, Krampuslauf or Krampus runs, continues to this day. Young men dress in detailed hand-carved wooden masks and fur costumes, some costing thousands of euros, and parade through towns carrying torches, ringing cowbells, and playfully scaring spectators. These aren't simple costume parades. The masks are works of art, carved with incredible detail, no two exactly alike. The performers take their roles seriously, staying in character as they chase children and adults alike through the streets. It's Christmas entertainment, Alpine style, equal parts scary and exciting. Krampus isn't alone in the pantheon of dark Christmas figures. Across Europe, St. Nicholas has had various fearsome companions. In Germany, some regions featured Knecht Ruprecht, a bearded man in dark clothes who carried a switch to beat bad children. Belsnickel, another German Christmas figure, wore tattered furs and carried both candy and a switch, determining on the spot whether children deserved treats or punishment. France had Père Fouettard, or Father Whipper, a sinister figure whose legend tells of a butcher who lured and murdered 3 children. In the folklore, St. Nicholas miraculously resurrected the children and forced the butcher to become his servant, traveling with him to dispense punishment to naughty children. The Netherlands had Zwart Piet, or Black Pete, whose appearance and traditions have become increasingly controversial in modern times. In Iceland, folklore told of the Yule cat, Jólakötturinn, a massive, vicious cat that, according to legend, prowled the countryside during Christmas, threatening to eat anyone lazy enough not to have received new clothes before Christmas Eve. These dark figures served an important purpose. They were the stick to St. Nicholas's carrot, the fear that made his generosity more precious. They taught children that actions have consequences, and that the winter season, for all its celebration, still held dangers. They also provided an approved way for chaos and fear during the darkest time of year. But perhaps most importantly, these traditions remind us that Christmas hasn't always been the sanitized, commercialized, family-friendly holiday we know today. For much of its history, Christmas was wild, unpredictable, and more than a little dangerous. It was a time when the normal rules didn't quite apply, when the veil between order and chaos seemed thin, when anything might happen in the long, cold nights. This wild spirit of Christmas would eventually become so problematic that authorities in England and America would do the unthinkable. They would ban Christmas entirely. Imagine waking up on December 25th, planning to celebrate Christmas, and discovering that doing so could land you in jail or cost you a hefty fine. Sounds like fiction, right? Yet, for nearly a generation in the 17th century Massachusetts, celebrating Christmas was literally illegal. The story begins in England. By the early 1600s, Puritan reformers had grown increasingly uncomfortable with how Christmas was celebrated. To them, the holiday had become everything wrong with religion and society rolled into one festive package. Christmas celebrations featured excessive drinking, gambling, wild parties, theatrical performances, and the temporary flipping upside down of social classes through traditions like wassailing and the election of lords of misrule who ruled over holiday chaos. Puritans objected on multiple grounds. First, religiously. They studied the Bible closely, and nowhere in Scripture could they find any mention of celebrating Christ's birthday. To them, any religious practice not clearly commanded in the Bible was suspicious, possibly against their faith. The fact that December 25th had non-Christian origins only strengthened their belief that Christmas was, in the words of one Puritan writer Philip Stubbs, a time of great dishonor of God. Second, they objected morally. Christmas had become, in their view, an excuse for the worst human behaviors. Increase Mather, one of the most prominent Puritan ministers in Massachusetts and father of Cotton Mather of Salem witch trial fame, wrote angrily about Christmas celebrations involving competitions, in interludes, in playing at cards, in revelings, in excess of wine, in mad mirth. Third, they objected politically. Christmas was associated with the Church of England and Catholicism, both of which Puritans were trying to purify away. The word Christmas itself contained Mass, which was too Catholic for Puritan comfort. One character in Ben Jonson's play The Alchemist insists on saying Christ-tide instead. When civil war broke out in England between supporters of Parliament and Royalists, the Puritan-controlled Parliament saw an opportunity to reshape society according to their strict interpretation of Christianity. In 1644, a law declared that Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun were no longer to be celebrated as special holidays. Instead, December 25th should be a day of fasting and reflection on the nation's sins. In 1647, Parliament went further, officially banning all Christmas celebrations. No special church services were allowed. Shops were ordered to remain open. Decorations were forbidden. Soldiers patrolled the streets, tearing down any greenery they found and breaking up any gatherings that looked suspiciously festive. The public reaction was swift and furious. On Christmas Day, 1647, riots broke out in Canterbury when the mayor attempted to force shops to stay open and arrested a shopkeeper who had closed for the holiday. The crowd freed the arrested man, attacked the mayor, and seized control of the city for weeks. Pro-Christmas riots erupted in other cities as well. In Norwich, Ipswich, and elsewhere, people took to the streets demanding their holiday back, decorating their doors with holly and ivy in defiance of the ban. The controversy became deeply political. Royalists seized on Christmas as a symbol of everything good about the old ways that Parliament was destroying. They portrayed themselves as defenders of tradition, hospitality, and English culture against Puritan strictness. Satirical poems and pamphlets mourned the loss of Christmas, showing it as an old friend driven into exile. After Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector in 1653, he's often blamed for banning Christmas, but this isn't quite accurate. The ban predated his rule, and Cromwell himself never issued any specific anti-Christmas decrees. However, he did nothing to reverse the ban either, and his government did enforce stricter Sunday observance laws and continued sending soldiers to prevent Christmas celebrations. The ban proved incredibly unpopular and difficult to enforce. People continued celebrating Christmas in private homes, away from prying eyes. Fishing towns and other areas far from the centers of Puritan power were notorious for ignoring the ban entirely. There's actually no record of anyone being successfully prosecuted under the Christmas ban, suggesting authorities recognized the political danger of pushing too hard. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II, the Christmas ban officially ended in England. Poet Poor Robin celebrated, "Now thanks to God for Charles' return, whose absence made old Christmas mourn. For then we scarcely did it know, whether it Christmas were or no." But across the Atlantic in Massachusetts, the story took a different turn. The Puritans who settled New England brought their anti-Christmas attitudes with them. William Bradford, governor of Plymouth Colony, recorded in his diary that on their first Christmas Day in America in 1621, some newly arrived settlers claimed it was against their conscience to work on Christmas. Bradford told them to stay home if they felt that strongly. But when he returned at noon, he found them playing games in the street. His response was decisive. If they were going to make Christmas a matter of religious devotion, they could keep it in their homes, but there would be no gaming or reveling in the streets. As Massachusetts Bay Colony grew and tensions with England increased, the colonists' rejection of Christmas became more formal and more political. In 1659, the General Court of Massachusetts passed a law declaring, "Whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way, would be fined 5 shillings, roughly equivalent to $50 today." The law wasn't primarily about people quietly praying at home. It targeted the disruptive public celebrations, the wassailing tradition where poor people would show up at rich people's doors demanding food and drink, often with alcohol-fueled aggression, the rowdy parties, the gambling, the chaos. The Puritans were trying to maintain their vision of a well-ordered, godly society, and Christmas threatened that order. The ban lasted until 1681, when an English-appointed governor, Edmund Andros, finally repealed it under pressure from the Crown. But even after the law was gone, the cultural disapproval remained. Christmas wasn't widely celebrated in Boston until the mid-1800s. As late as 1870, schools in Boston required students to attend classes on Christmas Day. The U.S. Congress, reflecting this lack of reverence for the holiday, remained officially in session during the Christmas period for decades. While they typically didn't meet in chambers on December 25th itself, between 1789 and 1857, Congress only declared a formal Christmas recess 3 times. In fact, the House of Representatives actually convened on Christmas Day only once during that entire period, in 1802, while the Senate met once on Christmas in 1797. The message was unmistakable. Christmas simply wasn't considered significant enough to warrant special recognition. The Puritan legacy left Christmas in a weakened state in much of New England for generations. The holiday had been interrupted, its traditions scattered, its cultural transmission broken. It would take new influences from other cultures and a complete reimagining of what Christmas meant to bring the holiday back to life in America and England. That reimagining would come from an unlikely source, Victorian England, and one author in particular, whose name has become almost synonymous with Christmas itself. By the early 1800s, Christmas in England was in a state of decline. The medieval traditions had faded. The Puritan ban had broken the holiday's cultural traditions. Industrialization was pulling people from rural villages where old customs continued into crowded cities where no one was quite sure how to celebrate anymore. Christmas still existed, but it was becoming a minor, barely observed holiday, especially in urban areas. The revival began with an interesting combination of looking back to the past and creating new ideas. Young Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837 and married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840. Albert brought with him German Christmas traditions, particularly the decorated Christmas tree. In 1848, the Illustrated London News published an image of the royal family gathered around their Christmas tree at Windsor Castle. The picture showed Victoria, Albert, and their children in a warm family scene that captured the public imagination. If the royal family celebrated Christmas this way, with a tree, with family togetherness, with home warmth, then perhaps Christmas could be rethought for the industrial age. Christmas cards appeared in England in the 1840s, another new tradition that would become essential to the holiday. The first commercial Christmas card was created by Sir Henry Cole in 1843, the same year something far more significant happened. On December 19, 1843, a small book was published in London. Bound in red cloth and gold lettering, it contained only about 30,000 words and could be read in a single sitting. The author was already famous, but his recent work hadn't sold well, and he needed a hit. His wife was pregnant with their 5th child, money was tight, and he wrote this new book in a mad rush over just 6 weeks. That book was A Christmas Carol, and its author was Charles Dickens. The story is familiar now. Ebenezer Scrooge, a greedy, cold-hearted businessman, is visited by the ghost of his dead partner Jacob Marley, and then by 3 spirits representing Christmas past, present, and yet to come. Through these supernatural visits, Scrooge is shown the consequences of his greed and isolation. He witnesses his own lonely past, sees how others celebrate despite hardship, and confronts a future where his death goes without sadness, and his former clerk's son, Tiny Tim, dies from poverty and neglect. Scrooge transforms, becoming generous and kind, and the story ends with celebration and forgiveness. A Christmas Carol was an immediate sensation. The first printing of 6,000 copies sold out by Christmas Eve. It has never been out of print since. But the book's impact went far beyond sales figures. Dickens didn't just write a story, he wrote a vision for what Christmas could and should be in the modern world. At the time Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, England was in the midst of brutal industrial growth. Cities were crowded with workers living in terrible conditions. Child labor was common. The gap between rich and poor was vast and growing. The poor laws, supposedly designed to help the poor, were actually harsh systems that broke up families and subjected the poor to cruel conditions in workhouses. Dickens had experienced poverty firsthand as a child when his father was sent to debtor's prison, and young Charles was forced to work in a blacking factory at age 12, an experience that haunted him for life. A Christmas Carol was Dickens's response to all of this. The book is often remembered today as a heartwarming tale, but it was actually sharp social commentary disguised as a ghost story. When Scrooge asks if prisons and workhouses still exist and suggests the poor should go there, he's voicing common Victorian attitudes. When he suggests that the poor should die to decrease the surplus population, he's echoing real economic theories of the time. The ghost of Christmas Present throws these words back at him later with powerful effect. "Man, if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant, until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is." Most shocking is the appearance of two wretched children who emerge from beneath the ghost of Christmas Present's robe. Scrooge asks who they are. The ghost responds, "They are man's, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom." This wasn't gentle commentary. Dickens was telling his Victorian readers that they were creating a society that would destroy itself through ignorance and poverty if they didn't change, and he was saying that Christmas, properly understood, could be part of the solution. What Dickens created in A Christmas Carol was a vision of Christmas as a domestic, family-centered holiday focused on generosity, compassion, and human connection. The Cratchit family's Christmas dinner, humble as it is presented as something beautiful because they share it together with love. Fred's Christmas party is joyous not because of expensive food, but because of games, laughter, and welcome. Scrooge's redemption comes through connection, through choosing to be part of the human community rather than isolated from it. Dickens showed that Christmas could work in the city, that it didn't require the old aristocratic tradition of lords feasting with their peasants in rural manners. Instead, Christmas could be celebrated in small homes, in boarding houses, in shops, with whatever resources people had, as long as the spirit of generosity and connection was present. This was revolutionary. The book also helped revive and popularize several Christmas traditions. While Dickens didn't invent the phrase "Merry Christmas," his book certainly popularized it. The idea of Christmas dinner as a major meal, with turkey for those who could afford it or goose for those who couldn't, was reinforced by his detailed descriptions. The emphasis on Christmas as a children's holiday, with Tiny Tim at the emotional center of the story, helped shift Christmas toward being more child-focused. Ghost stories at Christmas, which might seem odd today, were actually a long English tradition that Dickens participated in and strengthened. Christmas falls at the darkest time of year, and for centuries, English people gathered around fires to tell frightening tales. Even the subtitle of A Christmas Carol calls it A Ghost Story of Christmas. The book had an immediate impact. The growing movement toward giving workers Christmas Day off gained momentum, with Scrooge's transformation serving as a powerful cultural example. Charitable giving at Christmas increased. The phrases from the book, "Bah humbug," and calling miserly people Scrooges entered the language permanently. Dickens continued writing Christmas stories for years, publishing special Christmas editions of his magazines that became annual traditions. He understood that Christmas needed both the weight of tradition and the energy of fresh celebration. He gave Victorians permission to create new customs while feeling they were honoring something ancient and meaningful. By the time Queen Victoria's reign ended in 1901, Christmas had been completely transformed. The Christmas tree, the Christmas card, the family dinner, the emphasis on children and gift-giving, the charitable spirit, the very idea that Christmas should be a major holiday focused on domestic warmth rather than public chaos, all of this had been established. Much of it came from or was reinforced by Dickens and other writers of his time. Christmas had been saved, or more accurately, reinvented. But it had also become something new, something more gentle and domesticated than the wild medieval celebrations. The question remained, in times of real crisis, would this new domesticated Christmas survive? Or could the old spirit of Christmas, the impulse toward human connection that transcended normal rules, still break through? The answer came in 1914, in the mud and blood of the Western Front, in one of the most shocking and moving events in Christmas history. When war broke out in August 1914, soldiers on all sides were told it would be over by Christmas. They believed it. They had to believe it. No one could imagine that what lay ahead was 4 years of industrialized slaughter on a scale humanity had never seen. But as December approached and the Western Front settled into a brutal deadlock of trench warfare, it became clear that Christmas would arrive with the war still raging. By late 1914, hundreds of thousands were already dead. The trenches stretched from Switzerland to the North Sea, a scarred landscape of mud, barbed wire, and death. The space between opposing trenches, no man's land, was a nightmare of shell craters, dead bodies, and twisted metal. In some places, the trenches were separated by less than 50 yards, close enough to hear the enemy talking, singing, suffering. Pope Benedict XV, who had become pope just a month after the war began, issued a plea on December 7, 1914, asking the warring nations to declare a Christmas truce, that the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sang. Both sides officially ignored the request. Military commanders on all sides feared that any fraternization with the enemy would weaken their soldiers' will to fight. But something remarkable was already stirring along the front lines, something the generals couldn't control. On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1914, British soldiers in trenches across Belgium and France began noticing something strange. Across no man's land, along the German lines, small lights appeared. Christmas trees, brought up from behind the lines, decorated with candles and placed on trench parapets. Then came the sound of singing. German voices carrying across the frozen wasteland, singing Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night, Holy Night. The British soldiers were stunned. After months of artillery bombardments and sniper fire, after watching friends die in the mud, the enemy was singing Christmas carols. Some British soldiers began singing back, God rest ye merry gentlemen. The strange duet continued through the night. O Tannenbaum, answered by the First Noel. Then came shouts in broken English. Tommy, don't shoot, we don't shoot. Some German soldiers called out, Merry Christmas, in English. The British, suspicious at first, thinking it might be a trick, began shouting back. As Christmas Eve turned into Christmas morning, something never seen before began happening. German soldiers began climbing out of their trenches, standing up in full view, unarmed. British soldiers, hearts pounding, did the same. Slowly, carefully, men from both sides walked into no man's land and met in the middle. They shook hands. They exchanged cigarettes, chocolate, buttons, badges, whatever small items they had. They showed each other photographs of families back home. According to accounts from the Philadelphia Evening Public Ledger, one German soldier reportedly said to a British soldier, We all have wives and children. We're just the same kind of men as you are. In some areas, soldiers helped each other bury their dead, men who had been lying in no man's land for weeks or months because it was too dangerous to recover them. They held joint burial services, British and German soldiers standing side by side, reading prayers over graves of both nationalities. And yes, in several places they played football. Unplanned matches broke out using whatever could serve as a ball, sometimes an empty tin, sometimes an actual football someone had. The games were chaotic, with dozens of players on each side and unclear rules, but they were played with genuine enthusiasm. One reported score was 3-2, Germany winning, though the accuracy of these reports is debated. What's certain is that in the middle of the worst war the world had yet seen, enemy soldiers were playing games together like children. The truce wasn't universal. In some sectors, the fighting continued. Some soldiers refused to participate, whether from loyalty to orders, hatred of the enemy, or simple caution. But along roughly 2/3 of the British-held Western Front, involving over 100,000 soldiers, the truce took hold. It lasted through Boxing Day in some areas, occasionally extending into the new year. Letters home from soldiers describe the surreal experience. British Lieutenant Geoffrey Heinecke wrote, "Germans and English met in no man's land, and talked and exchanged gifts." Rifleman Oswald Tilley wrote, "Just you think that while you were eating your turkey, I was talking and shaking hands with the very men I had been trying to kill a few hours before. It was astounding." One young German soldier was reportedly horrified by the mixing of enemies and scolded his fellow soldiers. "Such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you no German sense of honor left?" According to several historical accounts, that soldier was 25-year-old Adolf Hitler. The generals were indeed horrified when they learned what had happened. British High Command feared it would weaken morale and destroy the hatred necessary to fight. Orders were issued that such mixing with the enemy must never happen again. Some accounts suggest soldiers were punished, though records are scarce. More importantly, the military leadership made sure to rotate units frequently, so soldiers wouldn't spend long enough facing the same enemy units to develop any sense of shared humanity. As 1915 began, the war got worse. New horrors were introduced: poison gas, flamethrowers, increasingly powerful artillery. The early innocence of 1914, the belief that this was a glorious adventure that would end quickly, had died in the mud. The men who had survived the first months were hardened, traumatized, deeply changed. The innocence that had allowed the Christmas truce, the ability to see the enemy as fellow human beings caught in the same nightmare, couldn't survive repeated years of industrial warfare. There were occasional small truces in later years, local agreements to let each side collect their wounded or dead, but nothing approaching the scale of Christmas 1914. That spontaneous outbreak of peace, humanity asserting itself despite the commands of generals and governments, never repeated. Why did it happen at all? Christmas itself was certainly key. The carols, the decorations, the shared cultural connection created a bridge across no man's land. The soldiers, British and German, were mostly Christian, mostly came from similar working class or rural backgrounds, and most didn't personally hate each other. They were there because their governments had sent them, fighting for causes most of them barely understood. The Christmas truce became legendary almost immediately. Newspapers reported it, though some accounts were hidden or played down. Over the years, it's been turned into stories and legends, appearing in films, songs, and memorial services. In 2014, on the 100th anniversary, England and Germany played a friendly football match to honor the soldiers who had played in no man's land a century earlier. The truce stands as one of history's most powerful examples of Christmas's power to inspire peace and humanity, even in the darkest circumstances. It suggests that beneath the uniforms and nationalities, beneath the propaganda and orders, human beings still recognize their shared humanity. Even in the middle of hell, for just one night and day, they chose peace. It also stands as a tragic reminder. The truce didn't end the war. The soldiers who shook hands on Christmas Day were shooting at each other again within days. Many of the men who met in no man's land in 1914 were dead before the war ended. The Christmas truce showed us what we could be, but the 4 years of slaughter that followed showed us what we are. No discussion of Christmas would be complete without addressing its most recognizable figure. The jolly man in the red suit with the white beard has become so universal that it's easy to forget he hasn't always looked or acted this way. The story of how St. Nicholas became Santa Claus, and particularly the lasting myth that Coca-Cola invented him, reveals a lot about how Christmas traditions evolve and how we remember or misremember history. The real St. Nicholas was a 4th century Christian bishop who lived in Myra, now part of Turkey. He was known for his generosity, particularly toward children and the poor. One famous story tells of how he secretly gave money to 3 poor daughters of a religious man, throwing bags of gold through their window at night so they could afford to marry rather than being forced into prostitution. This tale of secret nighttime gift-giving would become central to the Santa legend. After his death, Nicholas was made a saint and became one of the most popular saints in the Christian world. His feast day, December 6th, was celebrated across Europe. He was typically shown in bishop's robes, red and white, carrying a staff, sometimes strict, sometimes kind. In many regions, St. Nicholas Day became the primary gift-giving holiday, more important than Christmas itself. The tradition evolved differently in different places. In the Netherlands, Sinterklaas, as the Dutch called him, arrived by boat from Spain, rode a white horse across rooftops, and left treats in children's shoes. He was often accompanied by a helper, though these helpers varied by region and have become controversial in modern times. When Dutch settlers came to New Amsterdam, later New York, in the 17th century, they brought Sinterklaas with them. The name gradually changed to the English version Santa Claus. But the modern version of Santa emerged from a particularly American process of cultural mixing and literary imagination. In 1809, Washington Irving published A History of New York under the fake name Diedrich Knickerbocker. It was a funny book that poked fun at Dutch culture in New York, and it portrayed Sinterklaas as a jolly, pipe-smoking Dutchman who flew over rooftops in a wagon, giving out gifts. Irving's version removed the bishop's religious imagery and made him more non-religious and playful. Then came the poem. In 1823, an anonymous poem titled A Visit from St. Nicholas was published, beginning with the now famous line, "'Twas the night before Christmas," later said to be written by Clement Clarke Moore, though some people question this. The poem fundamentally shaped the modern Santa myth. It described Santa as a jolly old elf, chubby and plump, arriving in a sleigh pulled by 8 flying reindeer whose names it provided for the first time: Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donder, and Blitzen. Santa came down the chimney carrying a sack of toys, filled stockings hung by the fireplace, and departed with a cheerful "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night." The poem didn't specify Santa's clothing color, describing him as dressed all in fur from his head to his foot. But it established the basic framework: the flying reindeer, the chimney entrance, the gift-giving on Christmas Eve, the jolly personality. Political cartoonist Thomas Nast played a crucial role in showing what Santa looked like. Starting in 1863, Nast drew Santa for Harper's Weekly over 3 decades. His early drawings showed Santa as a small, elf-like figure supporting Union soldiers during the Civil War, literally on the side of good against evil. Over time, Nast's Santa grew larger, more human-sized, and consistently wore red. By the 1880s, Nast had established many Santa details: the North Pole Workshop, the list of good and bad children, elves making toys, the image of Santa reading letters from children. Other artists in the early 1900s continued improving Santa's image. J.C. Leyendeckers' drawings for the Saturday Evening Post in the 1910s and 1920s showed a very modern-looking Santa in bright red and white. Norman Rockwell also contributed popular Santa images. This is where Coca-Cola enters the story. In the 1920s, Coca-Cola began advertising at Christmas, trying to position their cold drink as appropriate even in winter. In 1931, they hired illustrator Haddon Sundblom to create new Santa advertisements. Sundblom drew on all the previous traditions, particularly the description from "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," and created a warm, grandfatherly Santa in a bright red suit trimmed with white fur. Sundblom's Santa was remarkably consistent and appeared in Coca-Cola advertising every year from 1931 to 1964. The images were spread globally through magazines, billboards, and store displays. They became so common everywhere that many people assumed Coca-Cola had invented this version of Santa. But this isn't true. Santa was wearing red decades before Coca-Cola's campaigns. Thomas Nast's red-suited Santa predates Coca-Cola by about 50 years. The association of St. Nicholas with red and white bishop's robes goes back centuries. Other companies, including White Rock Beverages, had used similar Santa images in advertising before Coca-Cola. What Coca-Cola did was popularize and standardize. Sundblom's Santa was so appealing, so consistently drawn across so many years, that he became the main image. When people around the world imagine Santa Claus, they're often picturing something very close to Sundblom's creation. But Coca-Cola didn't create Santa from nothing. They combined and spread existing traditions. The persistent myth that Coca-Cola invented Santa, or that Santa wears red because of Coca-Cola's branding, is fascinating because it reveals how we construct and remember cultural history. The myth is simple, memorable, and fits neatly into narratives about corporate power and commercialization. It's also wrong, but correcting it requires explaining a much more complex, multi-century process of cultural evolution. The simple false story is easier to remember than the complicated true one. Santa's journey from 4th century bishop to global icon represents Christmas's evolution in miniature. An ancient religious figure becomes less religious, takes on different national forms in different places, then gets reimagined through books and art, turned into marketing, and finally spread worldwide. Each generation adds or removes elements, adapting the tradition to new contexts and needs. Today, Santa is at the same time a children's fantasy, a marketing tool, a cultural touchstone, and for some, a problem because of Christmas's focus on buying things. He's been adapted to fit different cultures, sometimes keeping his European appearance, sometimes changed to reflect local traditions. He's been criticized for various reasons, for pushing aside the religious meaning of Christmas, for encouraging materialism, for being a lie told to children, for continuing certain cultural stereotypes. But Santa persists because he represents something essential that humans want from Christmas: generosity, magic, reward for good behavior, the idea that someone out there cares whether children are happy. He's secular enough to be embraced by people of many faiths or none, yet he carries echoes of older religious ideas about judgment, redemption, and gifts we don't deserve but receive anyway. He's become, in his own way, a modern myth, not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of being a story that helps us navigate life and explain what we value. From ancient Roman parties to modern shopping malls, Christmas has been constantly dying and constantly reborn. It's been banned and brought back, darkened by terrifying folklore figures and brightened by Victorian sentiment, turned into a business beyond recognition, and occasionally, miraculously, still capable of inspiring sudden peace in the middle of war. The shocking stories we've explored tonight reveal that Christmas has never been one thing. It's been a non-Christian festival turned Christian, a Christian holiday turned into business, a family celebration and a community party, a time of generosity and excess, of light in darkness and very real terror, of real spirituality and fake marketing. Krampus reminds us that Christmas wasn't always safe and sanitized, that our ancestors understood the winter solstice as a time of both celebration and danger, when supernatural forces walked abroad. The Puritan ban reminds us that even beloved traditions can be threatened by those who believe they're protecting something more important, and that what Christmas means to people can become worth rioting for. Charles Dickens and the Victorian transformation remind us that traditions can be reinvented when they're no longer working, that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to adapt it for the present. The Christmas Truce reminds us that at its best, Christmas can transcend the divisions we create, that the impulse toward peace and human connection can break through even in the darkest circumstances, even if only temporarily. And the Santa Claus story reminds us that traditions evolve through countless contributions over centuries, that no one person or company owns Christmas, even when they claim to. Understanding these stories doesn't ruin Christmas. If anything, knowing the full, complex, often shocking history makes the holiday more meaningful. Christmas is strong because it can adapt. It survives because each generation changes it while claiming to preserve ancient traditions. It matters because we make it matter, investing our hopes, money, and emotions into a few weeks at the darkest time of year. The shocking truth about Christmas is that it's always been shocking, always been excessive, always been more than it appears on the surface. It's a holiday big enough to contain both Krampus and Santa, both banned celebrations and sudden truces, both ancient non-Christian rituals and Victorian innovations, both sincere spirituality and fake marketing. So this Christmas, when you hear familiar carols or see familiar decorations, remember the darker, stranger, more complex stories behind them. Remember the wild medieval celebrations, the defiant Puritans, and even more defiant rioters, the soldiers in no man's land, the evolution from saint to icon. Remember that Christmas has always been shaped by real people making real choices about what they value and how they want to live. Thank you so much for watching tonight's documentary. If you found these stories as fascinating as I do, please give this documentary a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue creating content like this. Drop a comment below and let me know which shocking Christmas story surprised you the most. Stay curious and be well.